Welcome to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can shoot an email to the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Coming to you today with a very exciting guest, especially as the election approaches rapidly. We are here with Tom Bevan, the co-founder and president of Real Clear Politics. Tom, thanks so much for stopping by.
Absolutely, Emily. Good to be with you.
There is so much to talk about, and I imagine—
Let's do it.
Yeah, I imagine on your end, things are swamped, but I want to start out with a really basic question, which is, which states will you be watching on election night?
So I'll be watching Florida to start because, Trump really can't win re-election unless he wins Florida. Florida is going to they do a pretty good job of counting ballots quickly in Florida. So we should have some pretty good data to get a sense of where the race stands. And then beyond that, if Trump holds most of his states from 2016, right? If he holds North Carolina, if he holds Florida, if he holds Georgia, if he holds Arizona-ish, then you move to the upper Midwest. And for me, the state there is Pennsylvania. It's where the Trump campaign believes they have their best shot at repeating. It's where both campaigns have been spending just an inordinate amount of time and money. It is where, based on the last debate, I think that Trump has been able to move the needle a little bit in terms of the issue of fracking and energy. So those are my two states.
Great. And with those two states, why do you think it is that Pennsylvania in particular is so in play right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, Michigan, the polls in Michigan seem to be a little less favorable to Trump. That's obviously the other state that he, was able to win. And Wisconsin, the polls are not as great there. They're spending a lot of time in Wisconsin as well. I think if the Trump campaign had to rank the states, they'd rank Pennsylvania first, Wisconsin second, Michigan third. I've got family in Wisconsin, so I'm keeping tabs on what's going on up there and what the mood is. So I think that's probably another state. But for Pennsylvania, I mean, it just has all the elements of opportunity for Trump to repeat in what he did in 2016. I mean, the rural parts of the state, as I mentioned, turned out huge for him. There's been a lot of reporting on Pennsylvania that suggests that there's a lot of enthusiasm for Trump there in ways that I haven't seen as much in Michigan or Wisconsin. So it's just one of those states that I think for whatever reason the dynamics are there, and it just also happens to be Joe Biden is from Scranton, as he likes to remind everybody, right? Lived there till he was 10 years old. So it's a real battle for both campaigns.
Now, talking about the demographics in Pennsylvania and states like Wisconsin actually reminds me of another state that the Trump campaign has poured a surprising, significant amount of resources into, and that's Minnesota. What do you think people should be watching for in Minnesota? Do you think that there's a significant chance that Donald Trump is able to actually win Minnesota?
So the polls in Minnesota, they actually are. And we don't have a lot of polling in Minnesota, certainly not as much as we have in some of these other battleground states like Pennsylvania or even Michigan. But the polls in Minnesota are actually better, the ones that we have for Trump, than the ones in Michigan right now. It's like 5 or 6 points is Biden's lead. It is, and obviously, Minnesota was sort of ground zero for not only George Floyd and the protests that follow, but also, parts of that city were burnt to the ground. And you did have Minnesota. One of the things about Minnesota, Trump only lost it by 1.5 points last time around. And he was sort of sneaky in Minnesota. People didn't see that shift. The Iron Range moved heavily. All the rural parts of the state moved heavily toward him. But Democrats were sort of caught sleeping. They didn't spend any time or money there. The Trump campaign didn't really spend a whole lot of time or money there. It was just part of that demographic shift that happened in the upper Midwest. This time around, completely different story. Democrats are activated there. They are, so they're putting effort into energizing the base. So I think might actually be tougher for Trump to win this time, just because he's not going to sneak up on anybody there. At the same time, to your point, I think, the demographic shift has continued. We saw like 30 mayors in the Iron Range endorse Trump. We've seen Colin Peterson, the congressman there, the Democrat, is, endangered there. And so basically, I think we know the western part of the state, the rural part of the state, is going to turn out heavily for Trump. And the question is, again, back to the suburbs around the Twin Cities, are they going to, be heavily, go heavily for Joe Biden? And, how does what happened there with George Floyd and the Minneapolis City Council defunding the police, the protests and the looting and all that stuff, how does that play into whether, how the suburbs vote there? I think the Trump folks think they have a chance. They're not banking on it. I think they pulled their ads from there recently and refocused them in other places that they think they have a better chance. But I mean, Minnesota could be a state that we're looking at on election night and saying, probably should have seen that one coming if it does turn out to be an upset.
And that is another point that I think leads us into the big question that is on, I imagine, a lot of people's minds, especially outside the Beltway, which is, have the polls recalibrated to pick up possibly on some of that support that they do seem to have missed in 2016 from people who are either being undercounted or perhaps are too afraid to say that they support Donald Trump? Is it possible that we're still missing a slice of the electorate in those polls that could change things and could leave everybody reeling again next Tuesday?
It's certainly possible. And we won't know the answer to that until all the votes are counted. But, and it really depends on who you talk to. I mean, you've got folks like Robert Cahaly at the Trafalgar Group, right? They were the polling operation that the only ones that saw Trump winning in Pennsylvania, the only ones who saw Trump winning in Michigan. He's back with a series of polls this time around, showing the race much, much tighter in, sorry. He's back with a series of polls, this time around showing the race much, much tighter than other folks have it. Tighter in Pennsylvania. I think Trump, with maybe a lead in Wisconsin or close in Michigan. And he says that he's seeing, this idea that there's a submerged Trump vote, a shy Trump vote, is as strong as it was in 2016, if not stronger. You've also got, the pollster from Susquehanna thinks the same thing, thinks this race is much, much closer than a lot of other pollsters suggest. But then you've got, a lot of other polling operations and folks out there who say that they have adjusted, that they are taking into account, waiting for education, some of them, right? Which is one of the things that pollsters kind of, missed and didn't see coming last time. So, some people say, yeah, the pollsters have recalibrated and they're on it. And others are suggesting that no, they're still not. They're still missing, this Trump vote that's out there that's going to show up, primarily on election day. And so I guess we're going to have to find out and see. I mean, the balance of the evidence suggests that Joe Biden has a lead nationally and he is leading in these swing states. But his leading these swing states is it's bigger than Hillary Clinton's was at this point now, 4 years ago, but it's still not so big that it is inconceivable that Trump could, have his supporters could turn out big on election day and that he couldn't win, a number of these states.
Is it a matter of people being undercounted, or, I mean, I'm sure it's a combination of both, but is it also just that there are, even reflecting on what happened in 2016, maybe we were able to kind of assess whether it was that people were genuinely just too afraid to tell pollsters that they supported Trump? Is there evidence for that? And what combination of factors led to that sort of whiff from the pollsters in 2016?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked this question a lot about the polls, and there's no question that I think the pollsters, the national polls were accurate. I mean, our final average had Hillary Clinton winning by, I think, 3.3%, and she won by 2.1. The national polls were actually more accurate in 2016 than they were in 2012 or, even a couple of the other cycles. So, and even some of the state polls, as I mentioned, our final average in Pennsylvania was under 2 percentage points, including the last poll that we put in, which was Trafalgar, which showed Trump winning. Um, our final map on election day, electoral map, had Clinton winning, I think, 272 to 266. I mean, but if you didn't know anything about the campaign, if you just beamed yourself down from Mars on election day, November 6th, and you looked at that map, you would have thought, wow, this is a pretty close race. But that's not the way it was portrayed to the American people, right? By the so-called experts, right? David Plouffe, Obama's former campaign manager, on national television in September, saying, Hillary Clinton has this race 100% in the bag. All these pseudo, statistical analyses suggesting that, there was a 97.2865% chance that, Hillary Clinton would win, and Donald Trump's chances were, tiny. It's just like the public was, and all of that was filtered through, I think, a pundit class with a preconceived notion of this race, that Donald Trump was a joke. He couldn't win. He would never be elected. And so they picked those data points and said, well, I mean, gosh, she's up in the national polls. She's up in these swing states. So of course she's going to win this race, right? But there was other evidence that was pointing to the fact that this was a very competitive race. And we're seeing some of that this time around. Biden's lead in the polls are larger. And therefore, I think the pundits are sort of, the pundit class is sort of reflecting that. I mean, the idea that, Trump's been a terrible president. His, job approval is under 50%. The 225,000 people are dead from a coronavirus that happened on his watch. How could a majority of Americans, even a plurality of Americans in these states, possibly vote to reelect him? I feel like there's some of that in the coverage. But again, we're going to find out on election day when all the votes are counted, or maybe after election day. We'll have to see how that goes. I think this race is trending toward being close, and being closer to a repeat of 2016 than the other end of the spectrum, which is a Biden blowout where he wins all these states, including, Georgia and Texas. And it's a national wipeout, which is what some of the pundits are suggesting. I don't think that's going to be, I could be wrong, but I think we're in for, because in part because the country's so divided, and it is 2020, and so like whatever the worst case, craziest scenario is, that's usually what's been happening this year. I think we will be into recounts and court battles, and it's going to be an ugly post-election period this time.
And I'm curious also as to where the RCP average is really like in my opinion, the single most helpful tool in political media. And if you compare the average in swing states in 2016 to where the average in those swing states is now, is Trump underperforming compared to where he was against Clinton when you zoom in on some of maybe those Rust Belt states?
Yeah, so we're tracking the top 6 battleground states: Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and then the Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And so for some time in the last, let's say, 2 weeks, Biden's lead, he was actually below, right at or below where Hillary Clinton was at this point 4 years ago. But in the final days of that race, Hillary Clinton's lead really sort of decreased in the swing states, and Biden's has held more steady. And so right now, I think Biden's about a half a point better than Hillary Clinton was. And these numbers are changing all the time. So, if you go look at the website and it's not exactly a half a point, that's because we're loading in new polls in these swing states literally every hour, if not more. But so I think Biden's now overperforming where Hillary Clinton was at this point in the race. That race in 2016 in those swing states was closing. Biden's lead seems to have been, and this is true nationally and in some of these swing states, to have been more stable than, there hasn't been these wild bounces or swings that we saw occasionally in 2016 where, Trump would, like he caught Hillary Clinton, for example, tied her in the national polls right after the GOP convention. We just didn't see that this time around. It's been a much more stable environment.
Interesting.
Which is odd given how crazy things are.
Right.
And have been.
Kind of counterintuitive.
Right.
Do you think we will know who the winner is on election night? And if not, how long do you think it will take?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's going to be close. I think there will be court battles. I think I don't know when we're going to know who the winner is. I suspect, I mean, look, given all these mail-in ballots and, the decision by the Supreme Court to let Pennsylvania, accept ballots for days after, and in some of these other states, it'll take days to count them. I think if it is close, and particularly, just in Pennsylvania alone, it'll take a few days to get a final tally. And then if that tally is close, you can bet that there will be, court battles over recounts, and certainly depending on who wins and loses, I suspect there will be battles over ballots being rejected, the naked ballots, or any of these absentee ballots that are, for whatever reason, have been rejected. I suspect Democrats are, especially if Trump loses, we're going to be in for the mantra. We got to count every vote. We can't declare who wins this election until we count every single vote. And that will involve sort of this long, drawn out process that, as we saw in Florida in 2000, I think it's going to be like that, but worse.
Can you explain to some of our listeners who might not be familiar with the naked ballot?
So the naked ballot is new. So in Pennsylvania, the mail-in ballots, right, you're supposed to fill them out, and then you put them in a security envelope, right, which you're supposed to sign, and then you put them in another envelope to mail, right? And so, but a lot of people are failing. They're putting them in the first envelope, but not putting it in the second envelope and mailing it. And it's called a naked ballot. And those ballots, I think by the statute, by law, will probably be rejected. And again, since we've seen, Democrats have, and now that, I don't know, 60 something million people have already voted early or voted by mail, and we've seen Democrats say they were going to utilize vote by mail and absentee balloting more than Republicans. It's quite possible that a lot of those votes are going to be Democratic votes that get disqualified. And a typical rejection rate in a presidential year in 2016, it was like 1.2%, which is not a lot. I mean, but when you're talking about millions and millions of ballots, that still could be a sizable number. And then we saw the rejection rates go up in 2016. They went up again during the 2020 primaries. And now you're in a situation where you have these states where, millions and millions of folks are going to be voting for the first time, all right, by mail-in ballot, by absentee ballot. And so the rejection rates could be, 2%, 3%. And then you start talking about, you're getting into sizable numbers, especially, again, if you've got a state like Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin, where last time around it was decided by, 11,000 votes, 20,000 votes, 70,000 votes, it could be a real significant factor.
And just to think about Pennsylvania alone is sort of a frightening prospect, because as you say, if it's close at all, this is almost certainly going to a court battle, and Pennsylvania is almost certain to be close.
Well, I mean, right now Biden's up about 4.5 points in the average of polls. Some of the polls show it, 2 points, some show it 7 points, but right now I think his average is about just under 5. Now, if he wins by that amount, that's beyond a recount. That's beyond a situation where it's likely that a rejection rate would be causing that kind of, that magnitude. So, but if it is, I mean, if the race closes, if Trump overperforms his final polls and it is down, in the 0.5 percentage range or something, then, all bets are off in terms of, because neither campaign, that's the other part of this. I think that both campaigns have actively sort of worked to undermine the process and the integrity of the election process. Trump talks about, the opportunity for abuse and fraud with all these mail-in ballots. And while I think there's some legitimacy to that, Biden, the Democrats came up with this crazy conspiracy that Republicans were ripping, post office boxes out of the, off the street and hauling them away. And Biden said the other day, I think that, the only way he could lose is if there's chicanery at the polls. Well, so the American public is already primed to think that there are going to be shenanigans. And then you have all these poor, county clerks around the country that are going to be processing 10 times, 20 times, 100 times the number of mail-in ballots that they've ever handled before. It's a setting aside whether you think there's going to be fraud and abuse. It's just a recipe for, a total train wreck.
Hmm. I want to ask about two early indicators on that happy note. Sean Trendy published a really interesting piece for you guys on what to make of early voting, which Trendy argued was pretty much absolutely nothing.
Right.
Vincent,
I,
that. And
I'm fully on board with that.
okay, see, this is what I was going to ask about early voting and the spike in Republican registrations that we've seen in a state like Florida. So if you could just go over what we should make of both of those things.
Yeah. So, I mean, generally, registration, that's an affirmative action by someone to sign up and designate yourself a member of a party. I mean, that's much more significant than trying to read the tea leaves for early voting, because some of these states, you can't even tell what party they're voting for. They're not by registration, by party ID. And it's also, it's hard to tell, are these new voters, are these voters that are just would otherwise show up on election day, that are just utilizing, so the idea, when they talk about, oh, the early votes this and the early votes that, we went through this last time around. It's a newer feature of because more people are engaging, more states are engaging in early voting. It's this new phenomenon where everybody wants to try and look at the early vote and divine from that what the election outcome. I agree with Sean. I think it's a terrible idea. I think it's in some ways futile for the most part. And so I don't do it. I mean, I don't recommend anybody does it. Registrations is a little bit different. I mean, because that's a symbol of affirmative action being taken place by members of the population of each state. And so you can really tell when in Pennsylvania, Republican registrations have surged. They're still behind Democrats there, but I think that gives you a better indicator, again, not of an election outcome, but just of sort of where the trends are, where the movements might be in terms of the various enthusiasm among and identification among the parties.
Hmm. And a question I have is, we've seen the Trump campaign really cling to the stories and the new reporting on Hunter Biden. And obviously there's a lot of legitimate information there to consider, and there's information that voters should absolutely be considering. Do you think there are any indications that this will sway voters, that this will make, I mean, Ted Cruz said just last night, I believe he told Axios, it's not going to change people's votes en masse. Have you seen any movement in the polls after the story was published? And either way, do you think it is something that would sway voters?
It's hard. I mean, I don't. Well, let's take the first part. I mean, the way the media has sort of circled the wagons around this story, not only sort of the national political press, but also the social media folks like Twitter and Facebook and others, has been really sort of astonishing. And this idea that now we're employing this standard, well, we can't verify that. I mean, Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes, right? We can't verify that, so what? We can't report on it. It's a curious standard to apply after the 3.5 or 4 years that of standards that they've used to run stories about, the P tape and all this other crap from the dossier and anonymously sourced stuff that turns out to be bad or wrong or whatever. So that's one thing. So I'm not sure how many people have actually seen it. And again, when you think about this in terms of, hard partisans on either side, right? It's not moving any of those. If you're a Democrat and you're in favor of Biden, you think this is a nothing burger, a smear campaign, whatever, you're not going to suddenly stop and not vote for Joe Biden over this story. Conversely, if you're a Republican, Trump supporter, you look at the story and you're like, well, of course Biden's corrupt. We knew that all along. We've known it, yada, yada, yada. So if you're an actual persuadable, to the extent, I don't even know how many of those there are still left out there. And you live in one of these states where it's actually going to matter, right? You're not a persuadable in my home state of Illinois, which isn't going to matter, right? If you live in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin, does this story rise to the level where you look at it, if you even have heard about it, and say, yeah, Biden's he's corrupt, and therefore I'm going to vote for Trump. I just don't. I'm on board with Ted Cruz. I don't think it's going to move a lot of votes. I think if you're still undecided at this point, I'm not sure that's the story that's going to. Now, that doesn't mean that. I mean, if you're a Trump supporter, or you were a Trump, let's say you're a Trump voter in 2016, and now you're on the fence because you don't like Trump's personality, right? You like his policies, you don't like him, and so you're like, oh, I just can't take 4 more years of this. I don't really want 4 more years of the chaos and all that. I like his policies, but I'm leaning toward Biden. And the story comes out, and you hear about maybe there are a few of those voters who are like, you know what, I'm just my flirtation with Joe Biden is over. I'm going to go back to Trump because I do think he's corrupt. Maybe there's some of that. Maybe there are a few Biden supporters who are, soft, independent voters who maybe it doesn't drive them to Trump. Maybe they're just like, oh, I was going to vote for Biden, but you know what? Everybody, they're both corrupt. They both suck, and I'm just going to throw up my hands and not vote. But I think those scenarios that we're mentioning are so small on the margins that I can't imagine it having any sort of significant impact in the sort of final analysis of this race.
That's helpful because Hillary Clinton continues to cite Nate Silver and, go back to the moment that Comey announced the emails that have been located on on Huma Abedin's
right.
Anthony Weiner's laptop. And she still says that sort of was a late last minute shift in the polls in Trump's favor. Do you think that there's anything conceivably in the next, 5 days or 7 days that could have an impact like Hillary Clinton seems to believe Comey had?
Probably not. Probably not. The difference there are two differences between 2016 and the Hunter Biden laptop and the Anthony Weiner laptop, right? Number one, we do have a lot more people that have already voted. Right. When this story came out, it was, it's 60 million now. It was probably, half that or something when it even, and the media, as I mentioned, sort of blacked it out for the first few days. So, and number two, the Anthony Weiner laptop, the James Comey announcement, that sort of reinforced a narrative that was already in place about Hillary Clinton. People already knew about her emails. They were already sort of, she had offered this explanation, like that, I cleaned it with, like what, wiped it with a cloth, just her narrative had not flown, had already, I think, been part of that campaign. And so it sort of reactivated a lot of those concerns. And by the way, there were plenty of other things that people didn't like about Hillary Clinton is why they ended up voting for Donald Trump instead of her. Biden's not in the same category in that regard. People generally, he's a fairly known quantity, and he's known as, being sort of, affable. And yes, he's been in Washington for 47 years, but people think he's he's just average Joe, lunchbox Joe from Scranton. So to introduce this narrative that he's this corrupt politician, 10 days before the election, when the media blocks it out and people have already started voting, it's just two completely different scenarios. And that's why I think this one probably isn't going to, that doesn't mean the story is going away, because I think it is, the first week we were told it was Russian disinformation, and now we're being told, well, it's not disinformation, but it's just, there's no evidence to connect Joe Biden, personally to this. And, poor Hunter was just out selling influence, and that's, everybody understands that that's what he was doing. That's not new news. So I think the story is not over. And if Biden wins, it might be part of a transition and a new Biden presidency that might dog him for a while, but we'll have to see how that all plays out.
Is there a chance that a story like this depresses turnout in some of the urban areas that cost Democrat states like Wisconsin in 2016? Is that something that's in the realm of possibility, or would it be too marginal to really?
My guess is it's too marginal because not enough people are going to hear about it. It is not going to be, it's not going to rise to the point of salience for most voters, number one. And number two, I just don't think that if you're already locked into voting for Biden, I'm not sure, that this is going to discourage you. Maybe on the margins, there are a few people, like I said, who throw up their hands. But for a lot of Democrats, this election isn't even about Joe Biden. It's about Donald Trump, and they're turning out to vote against him rather than for Joe Biden.
Right, that makes sense. If Trump loses, what do you think the demographic that Republicans will point to? Is it the suburban women that we've heard so much about? And I mean, obviously it's a factor of all of the demographics, but is there one key demographic that Republicans will be underperforming with, that is it those suburban women?
Oh, well, I mean, he's had problems he had problems with women in 2016. It's sort of gotten worse in 2018. I suspect the suburban women are going to vote against him in sort of en masse this time. The problem that Trump has experienced, I think, is more with seniors than with suburban women. That's been a problem he's had. But the senior thing is pretty new, and so Biden's and I think it's mostly driven by COVID. And the feeling of that Trump hasn't handled the coronavirus well, that he doesn't take it seriously, and it disproportionately impacts folks 65 plus, and so that may be, in the end, we look back and we're like, seniors were the difference in a state like Florida or Arizona, if he doesn't pull that out. There's also I saw a poll earlier talking about how his lead with men has been slipping. Men have sort of been the bedrock of the Trump coalition, white men in particular. So we'll have to see where all of this nets out. But right now it looks like seniors are his biggest problem.
There's a lot of disbelief in the sort of political class about some of these polls we've seen picking up on a surprising amount of support for Trump among Hispanics and Blacks, particularly men in both of those demographics. What do you make of those polls? Do you think they're overemphasizing any trend, or do you think Donald Trump is genuinely really making inroads for the Republican Party with them?
So I actually talked off the record with someone from the Trump campaign the other day, and their sense of this is that they are doing better with Black men, young Black men in particular, but that African American women sort of hate Donald Trump more than ever. And so whatever gain they're getting out of increased support among young Black men, who, by the way, are probably forget race, just young men in particular are, like the hardest to turn out. The question is whether they're going to show up at the polls. So I'm not sure if, I saw someone say the other day, someone on the Trump campaign said they think they're going to get, hit double digits, 12% with African Americans. I think that assumes a scenario where they do get a lot of turnout from young African-American men, but the Hispanic stuff, I think, is real. It is real in the Cuban vote in Florida, but it is real in other places as well. And as you mentioned, I think with Hispanic men in particular, I do think that there is, a chance that Trump's could do significantly better with Hispanics. And again, you look at a place like Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, even certainly Florida. That could be, a real boon for Trump in terms of offsetting seniors and some of these other groups that we talked about. If he's able to do that, and if there is big turnout among Hispanics, and Trump's able to win. I mean, the Trump campaign is talking like they are going to win as much of the vote as George W. Bush won in 2004, which is like 40% of the Hispanic vote, which would be astonishing, quite frankly, if that's what it turns out to be.
Now, this is more of a broader kind of perennial question for everybody who's sitting at home on Tuesday night and, watching cable news and refreshing their social media feeds. What do you make of exit polling, and what do you think people around the country should make of exit polling as those numbers start rolling in?
I do not. Same with the early vote. I mean, I just ignore it. I really do, because everybody, election days are so funny, Emily, because they're the one day where it's sort of like hurry up and wait. Like you wake up and there's so much excitement, and then you're like, I gotta wait till like 7 o'clock. And so you're like mulling around all day, and then you get all jazzed up for the first hint of, and I do this too. I'm checking out, what's the weather in North Carolina? Oh my God, how's that going to affect like turnout? Oh my gosh, it's raining in Orlando. Oh no. trying to figure out like what this all means. And then you get these first wave of exit polls, and they're always off. They're always wrong. And yet they color a lot of the coverage. I mean, on election night in 2016, I was in New York. I was on with Shepard Smith on Fox News. And, one of the guys that was with us on our panels was this Democratic consultant from Florida. And he was checking, he was watching Florida, the precinct level data really, first we got the exit polls. Oh, Florida's in the bag. And the first, as he was getting the first data, it was like, oh, this looks great. We got this locked. And like an hour later, it was like, well, that looks a little funny. And like an hour later, he's like, oh my God, we're going to lose. So I think you really, really have to, as much as people really want, we've been sort of, waiting for this thing for, 2 years or 4 years or whatever. As much as people really want to rush and come to conclusions about what the final outcome is going to be this year in particular, when people are going to be counting votes for days, I think we have to kind of, employ a little discipline. And that really starts for me with the exit polls. I mean, I would tell people to just ignore them.
Hmm. Now, is there an underdog Senate candidate you think out there? My pick would be John James. I think John James is going to do better than people expect. But is there a candidate in particular that you think is going to surprise everybody?
So I was on Fox News the other night. I was on Special Report with Brett Baer, and we were asked to pick our sleeper, our Senate race that we're watching. And of course, I think Kristen Soltis Anderson picked North Carolina, and Josh Krashower picked Iowa. I picked Minnesota, which is a bit of a stretch, right? Nobody's talking about it, but we have a couple of polls there that show that race closer than I think Democrats want it to be. One of them has Tina Smith's lead at 4 points. One has her lead at 1 point. Both of those polls show her under 50%. And I mentioned that was my race to watch. And like the next day, Congressman Jason Lewis had to go like for emergency surgery and he's fine. So, wish him a speedy recovery and everything. But, he's going to spend the final days of the campaign in the hospital, which, can't be good for his campaign. So I don't know. I mean, I still think going back, if there's going to be an upset in Minnesota, if Trump's going to actually overperform the polls in Minnesota, there could be a situation where, because there's very little split ticket voting anymore. I mean, people just don't do it. And so every Republican that's going to turn out to vote in this election, now maybe they won't vote for the Republican Senate candidate, right? And that's part of the problem is you look at the polls around the country. I mean, a lot of these Republican Senate candidates, Martha McSally in Arizona, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, they're running 2 or 3 points behind where Trump is. And so, there will be situations where people are going to try out to vote for Donald Trump, but maybe they leave that they're not going to vote for the Democrat for Senate, but they maybe leave it blank because they're not so fired up about, a Tom Tillis or something. And Trump is not able to drag some of these folks across the finish line, assuming he, has a good night. But he might be able to. And so Minnesota could be, that would be like now it's my super dark horse sleeper race to watch. I agree with you about Michigan. I think John James he's one of the only candidates who's actually been overperforming Trump, right? The polls for Trump in Michigan have not been great, but James has been, 3, 4, 5 points closer to Gary Peters than Trump has been to Biden. So, but is it, if Donald Trump doesn't perform well in Michigan, how is John James going to get over the hump there? It's going to be hard for him, I think.
That makes sense. Do you have an opinion on how the Cal Cunningham sex scandal affair has impacted Tillis's race? Because it seemed at first like it wasn't really doing much and moving the needle, but Tillis does seem to be picking up a little steam here lately.
Yeah, so the last 3 polls there, I mean, one had the race tied. And this is like post revelations of, sexting / affair. Then we had a poll showing Cunningham +6, although that was when you take apples to apples, the movement in that poll from its previous poll to this poll was, it was, I think he was at like 10 in that poll, went down to 6. And then Trafalgar just came out with a poll today showing Tillis up 2. So in the average, Cunningham is still ahead, but he used to have a pretty substantial lead in that race and on the order of like 5 or 6 points. And it was pretty stable until this thing hit. And so it's much, much tighter. It is much, much tighter. And I suspect that's going to be one of those ones. If Biden wins North Carolina, Cunningham's going to win. If Trump wins North Carolina, then I suspect Tom Tillis Trump will drag him across the finish line.
If you had to guess right now, do you think Republicans keep the Senate?
So we have a feature on our site, which is called a no toss-up map, and we do this for the presidential race, for the Electoral College, and for the Senate. And it allocates the states based on where our Real Clear Politics averages stand, like right now. And so if the election were held today, which it's not, and if our averages were exactly spot on, which they won't be, it shows Democrats with a 4-seat pickup, which is what they would need to take control of the Senate. Now, and that includes Doug Jones losing in Alabama, right? So Democrats would be picking up Colorado, Arizona, Iowa, and Maine, I think is the other one. But I do think, again, I think if Trump wins North Carolina and the Trump campaign feels good about that, Tom Tillis could win there. I think if Trump wins Iowa and the Trump campaign feels good about their chances in Iowa, I think Joni Ernst, the last 2 polls there have Joni Ernst up 1 point each. So that race is sort of moved back in her favor a little bit. So she would survive there. And if those 2 races swing the Republicans' way, then you're at like a +2 for the Democrats. So they wouldn't take control of the Senate. So I think it's going to be really, really, really close. And it'll depend on who has the better night overall as a party on November 3rd.
Tom, you've been very generous with your time. I have one more question. And
Go for it.
Is there a single trend in polling in recent memory that you think is the most interesting or the most underappreciated, as we sort of like look back on maybe the Trump years or even before the Trump years? Is there something going on in polling? Are we picking up on some trend that you think people should spend more time thinking about?
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, part of the dynamic that we live in, well, we have 2 things at play here. We have a very divided country, and that's gotten more divided over time. And it happened, you sort of trace it back to different points in time. I mean, I think the real break was 2000, the election of 2000. From that moment on, I mean, these elections have been, Obama in 2008 was an anomaly in the sense that he sort of unified, Democrats and independents. But we've become, and Pew has some good research on the partisanship, right? How the parties have grown sort of more polarized and further apart. The partisan gaps on different issues now are as high as they've ever been. We've also, there was a Pew study that showed something like some crazy statistic, like 73% of people can't even agree on the same facts of a story, right? So we're watching 2 separate movies. And then you throw Donald Trump into the mix, who is the most polarizing, president in American history. I mean, so from the day that he took office, Democrats, I think he won 8% of Democrats on election day, and his approval rating among Democrats since election day has been under 10%. I mean, just flat line, doesn't matter what he does. Even when he does things that Democrats, a majority of Democrats agree with him on, like trade deals or whatever, no credit for it. On the other hand, you have Republicans, you got 85, something like that, 88% of Republicans on election day. His support among Republicans has gone up over time, but still pretty, you think about, and independents have sort of fluctuated in between, 30 to 35 to 40% in terms of their approval rating. But I mean, if you think about all the stuff that's gone on in Trump's presidency from, just everything's been a 5-alarm fire since the day he started, right? Including, the impeachment and all that. Those numbers don't move. And I think that's unique to Trump. I think whether he goes away next year or 4 years from now, I think we'll return to something that approaches, more normal historical standards. Because the one, back to your question about the polling, And trends. I mean, the metric that pollsters have looked at for a long time, and Sean Trinity talks about this, that correlates best with election outcomes has always been job approval, right? If you're at 50% or better on election day as a president, you win. And it makes sense. If 50% of people think the incumbent's doing a good job, they're going to vote to reelect him. I mean, it's just sort of common sense. If you're under 50%, you're probably going to lose. Donald Trump's never been at 50% in a job approval rating since the day he took office. Never. So he's already a historical anomaly in that sense. His approval rating in our Real Clear Politics average is about 45% now, which, again, by traditional metrics is a death sentence. By Trump standards, not pretty good, actually. He's been as low as 37. But so we've seen this very weird trend with Trump in particular, in terms of his job approval rating. So I'm not sure we can divine much, in terms of that trend as far as this election goes. And I don't think we'll see it again. I think we'll revert to something more normal. I'm not sure that answers your question exactly, but it's the best I got on short notice. You threw me a curveball there at the end.
I know, but it is fascinating. I thought your answer was fascinating because I do think probably the most important question is also the most impossible question to answer the Trump era, which is how much of this is unique to Donald Trump?
Right. Is this the new normal or, and look, quite frankly, that's part of Biden's strategy is he's suggesting that this isn't the new normal and he's going to return us to normalcy, pre-Trump. And I think there is some appeal for that out there. I mean, people do, you go back and look at these elections and invariably, it's the yin and the yang. It's like every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And so you have George W. Bush, who's the decider, and then we elect, Obama, who's sort of the no drama, consensus builder guy. And then that, we end up with Trump, and now we're swinging back in the other direction. I think there's something to that. And 4 years of Trump has been like, 10 years in like the way the news cycle moves these days. And because of his participation in social media, I mean, it's just there. I think there is some real fatigue out there, and Biden's trying to tap into that.
Interesting. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely, Emily. Thank you.
Absolutely. This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky. He's Tom Bevan. You can follow him on Twitter at TomBevanRCP. If you're like me, you will be glued to RCP for the next several days and probably after that as well. Thanks so much, Tom. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.